is that it mentions more binding commitments, but it doesn't actually explain what those commitments are. It says with a view to the most demanding missions, but it doesn't explain what most demanding means. And it says to fulfill the union level of ambition, but it doesn't state what the union level of ambition is. So we are left unawares. I have to say the words most demanding does conjure up the idea of high-intensity military actions up to and including war, euphemistically known as peacemaking, due to the need to include the word peace in some form of words to describe any EU military actions. I also have the EU Council decision of the 8th of December 2017. This actually established PESCO legally, and this is it here, and it names the participants in PESCO, of which Ireland is one. It's a little bit more specific in terms of the use of words, but there's still others that are left quite strategically vague, presumably to allow for some good room for interpretation and flexibility towards a maximalist interpretation of what's permissible. So this legally binding EU decision here defines PESCO as mandating member states to increase defence budgets, that's in Annex Point 1, to provide troops on standby for use in EU battle groups, which they just call EUBG, but as someone who's researched this for nearly 25 years, I know what that means. And that's in Annex Point 12. And then it says to join structures partaking in European external action in the military field, that's Point 13, and for common funding of military CSDP operations, CSDP being Common Security and Defence Policy, operations and missions. So I also have here Jean Monnet's memoirs. It's quite a thick book. And I always think it's instructive, if you want to understand the reasons for a new policy, go back to the origins of the policy and see what was said. It's quite instructive. So the origins of PESCO, or it's known now as the European Defence Union, is actually what's called the European Defence Community. And that stemmed from Jean Monnet's work in 1950, October 1950, when he was writing the plans for the European Coal and Steel Community. And it's useful to note the keywords used to describe that common defence community, because they think they resonate today. So it proposes the creation for common defence of a European army under the authority of the political institutions of United Europe. The Army of United Europe, made up of men from Europe's various nations, must as far as possible achieve a complete merger of the human and material elements it brings together under a single military and political authority. That's in Jean Monnet's memoirs, page 347. So this is what they call the Pleven Plan. It was a declaration to the French National Assembly on the 24th of October 1950, and it spoke for the first time in public about a European Defence Minister responsible to a Council of Ministers and a Common Assembly, which is what the Parliament is known as today, with a common European budget. And the contingents supplied by participating states will be incorporated into the European Army at the level of the smallest possible unit. So this proposal was actually scrambled together in less than a week, and it was put together because France had had its first major defeat in the Indochina War, and it was said to be put together in order to restore the French government's prestige in Europe. And finally, Monnet always said, "I've always believed that Europe would be built through crises." That's on page 417. And so it was decided that because war had just broken out in Korea, it gives Europe yet another reason for uniting, page 328. So he said the Federation of Europe would have to become an immediate objective. The army, its weapons and basic production will all have to be placed simultaneously under joint sovereignty. We could no longer wait, as we had once planned, for political Europe to be the culmination point of a gradual process, since its joint defence was inconceivable without a joint political authority from the start. It was actually the US Secretary of State, Jean Acheson, who told the French that the Americans would not send reinforcements to Europe unless the Europeans themselves had armed 60 divisions, 10 of which might be German. He said there's no question of raising a Wehrmacht, but simply of assigning these units to NATO under the unified command of an American general, probably Eisenhower. So Monnet surmised that the Pentagon was not prepared to strengthen its forces in Europe without a proportionate contribution from European units. And the French army was fighting a difficult war in Indochina. Britain's forces were scattered throughout the world, so it was natural to ask Germany to make up the balance. So in other words, it was because of what a lot of colonial nations were doing by committing their forces abroad that this idea of an army in Europe came about. Adenauer had said, "I will not agree to militarise Germany by establishing a national military force," to which Monet responded, "To help him in return, we could do no less than propose, in accordance with his wishes, a European army which would include German military capability." And Monet felt that the French Minister of Overseas Affairs, René Pleven, would be easy to convince, his words. So Jean Monnet said, with only a few days in which to invent it, he wrote up the EDC, European Defence Community Proposal, and called it the Pleven Plan. So I think that one last thing is that Monet claimed that by pooling the basic production and the establishment of a new high authority, which is the Commission, whose decisions will be binding on France, Germany and the countries that joined them, this proposal will lay the first concrete foundations of the European Federation, which is indispensable for the maintenance of peace. And Monet said the last word was the most important word, peace. That was on page 298, but another reason for it was mentioned 2 pages later in his memoir, and it was a lot more specific and aligned to current European practice. Monet added the sentence, which he thought was purely formal: "Europe will be able, with increased resources, to pursue the realization of one of her essential tasks, the development of the African continent." So basically, I think that it's puzzling that Ireland, which is a post-colonial, recovering post-colonial state, would want to join in with a proud tradition of supporting decolonising African nations and having an anti-militarist peace profile. And so it's in that context that I think the origins of PESCO, as it is known today, back in the 1950s, are important to draw out. And so now I'll finish there, and I will have the pleasure of introducing my esteemed panel.
I just seen the time over finishing out there, so I'm very quickly. So I'd like to thank the People's Movement and Anna for the invitation here to address the conference today, and I'd also like to thank Alison for the introduction and very, very kind words that she gave there. And I think there was some talk earlier on today about why are we doing this today, and and why we should be moving this forward. And I think today is a very worthwhile start, and it's the start of the process. And while everybody in this room is probably well rehearsed on the arguments around neutrality and the need to defend it, and that the wider public aren't. And I think it's important today in that there's such wide political representation here, which one thing or another, we do have a voice, and we can use that voice in All Ireland to articulate and put forward the views of an alternative view, I think, as well, to what we have been getting from the establishment parties of Fianna Fáil and Gael, and that and I think that's important, and it means that they don't have it as easy as they can always will have it, and we can actually develop that out further, and I think take that out to wider audience as well in the future, which I think is vitally important. Apologies probably before I start, just in case some of what I say today might duplicate with what you heard this morning. I wasn't here this morning, so apologies for that, just to get that out of the way before we start anyway, and we'll take it from there. I suppose one of the key areas of PESCO and first to Irish neutrality, I want to start with the fundamental point that militarisation, EU defence integration, and the overall global militarisation agenda has been pushed and approached, shaped by private sector interests, and I think that's very important, with the willing participation of political interests. And as we are here this weekend to discuss the dangers of EU military integration in Irish and to Irish society, leaders of the EU arms industry are partaking in a conference of their own. The Munich Security Conference is taking place this weekend, where they'll be mapping out how they are going to actually spend the money that we're going to give them in the future in our so-called defence. So EU defence company giants will seek to integrate their defence programmes so Europe can compete with US and Russian defence companies. And that ultimately is what this whole thing is about. It's about companies defending and making profits in the future, and profits on the backs of the ordinary citizens right across Europe. The German Defence Minister von der Leyen has repeatedly indicated ahead of the conference that she wants companies to form a consortia or to merge so that they can compete with US companies for bids on upcoming contracts. German Franco-military interests seek to develop their defence industries further so they can control the EU defence policy while globally competing with US and Russian defence companies. Global security will in turn secure Franco-German influence at home and in Europe. The process leading to PESCO was by no way a democratic one. A policy group was established by the EU Commission to develop PESCO, known as the Group of Personalities. This was a surprise. And which mainly included EU arms industrialists intent on finding ways for EU governments to navigate around national sovereignty and neutrality clauses so that greater EU military integration could be fostered. NGOs, human rights organisations, civil society, the academic world and the European Parliament were reportedly absent from the process, and we wonder why. Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil have essentially signed Ireland up to become a pawn in a very lucrative chess game, and we'll be paying for it both financially and politically for that privilege. One of the striking things about PESCO is how it seems to have caught everyone off guard. Well, everyone except the people in this room. And no, I'm thinking about this. I was going to say, that it was rushed through the Parliament, and it also went under the Irish media's radar. But I don't think that's really the problem at all. I think the Irish media have participated in the silence around PESCO and around that's their shame. And it made me think how this could have happened, and I think a lot of it is down to linguistics, but also it's down to actually a meeting of minds in terms of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and media interests to ensure that they pursue that agenda. And I was interested to hear earlier Roger talking about the mention of PANA on RTE. That's probably just a semblance of balance. And we give it a short mention today, but then I'm going to forget about it then from then on. So the language of war usually functions to mask the reality of violence and intent to inflict. You'll hear government discourse in defence of PESCO speak in terms of euphemisms and grand statements to legitimise itself and dismantle efforts made by the critics of war. It's important to acknowledge the discourse around PESCO and statements made in defence of EU militarisation. This linguistic game played by EU militarists will abuse our terms like neutrality and peacekeeping. Words bandied about by the government in defence of PESCO, despite the fact that peacekeeping isn't mentioned once in the legislation. Simon Coveney stated in the Dáil that PESCO would help UN-mandated missions engage in peacekeeping, conflict prevention, or the strengthening of national security. Again, this is war discourse attempting to legitimise itself while dismantling opposition voices. The government has stated time and again that there is no commitment to increasing Ireland's defence expenditure to 2% of Ireland's GDP, and that the increase in real terms relates to meeting the agreed objectives of PESCO and not to Ireland's overall defence budget. However, in the same sentence, the government states that the figure of 2% reflects a collective commitment by the participating member states to spend 2% of their defence expenditure on research and technology. So that's okay. If we spend it on research and technology, that provides jobs for people in Ireland who will be actually making the living out of killing people, and that's what we want. But also, as well as that, the 2% that they talk about was reflected in the GDP. It's in GDP, and they say that that's not entirely government expenditure, but our government expenditure of GDP is probably about 0.75%. So we will be spending that amount all the time, and we will be leading through government expenditure, through budgets. We will be leading the charge and actually putting that money forward and making sure that that money can be spent. And that will be at the detriment, as I'll say later on, in relation to other services across the country. So nevertheless, it is confirmation that Ireland will be diverting more and more state money towards EU military cooperation. We can expect that this figure will increase over time, with very little parliamentary oversight, now that PESCO has been signed up. And if you look closely, the budget is not a small number. Under the plan, European governments will come up with 17 relatively projects, including a €5 billion fund for military research, along with an existing €100 billion in EU defence spending. Not only will we have to dedicate increasing amounts of our GDP to EU defence spending, but it will inevitably lay the foundations for the development of an EU army. PESCO is a platform for expansion. Its own annex states that a long-term vision of PESCO would be to arrive at a coherent, full-spectrum force package in complementarity with NATO, which will continue to be the cornerstone of collective defence for its members. Many supporters of the EU military integration have stated their ongoing support to see a defence component included in the next multi-annual financial framework, including a defence component. Annual regular assessments will be conducted by the High Representative of the Union of Foreign Affairs and Security Policy to ensure that Ireland is honouring these commitments. So we'll have the pleasure of having not only the Troika, but now I don't know what to call the four-person one, but so there'll be an extra one added into it anyway. That we're here to see that we do spend as what we're saying will be spent on military spending. So military budgets should be 2% of gross domestic product, and that is what they are saying. And if Ireland were ever to reach this, we would require a five-fold increase in military spending, and Seamus has outlined a lot of that. And another commitment is to spend 20% of our total defence budget on military equipment and research to fill strategic gaps in EU defence. PESCO also signs us up to intensive involvement of a future European Defence Fund. The purpose is to develop an EU arms industry so that profits can be made by companies who manufacture the means of death and destruction. So long as Irish companies and foreign multinational companies in Ireland are making profit, it'll be okay. And as the journalist of Peter Teffer has said at PESCO, rather than a reflection of what security means and how to ensure it, the European strategy is dominated by developing and selling new capabilities. Supporting the defence industry has become a goal in itself. So the question is then, how will we actually support the defence industry? And it will be at the cost of health and housing and all the other government expenditure that we've seen. Because as I said earlier, while the GDP ratio in Ireland is the factor that they're talking about, government spending makes up a huge amount of that. So the corresponding expenditure will have to be government expenditure to ensure that we get that figure. So that means, and I think this is a key point for what the point that was made earlier on about how do we actually develop this further and how do we actually talk to the people out on the streets and the people who are walking up Dawson Street and Gaffin Street today who have no interest in PESCO and what's happening here. And how we do that, I think how we do that is there is campaigns ongoing right across the country around the health services, around housing and particularly, and other campaigns that are ongoing. And we need to make sure that when we talk about the fact that we want to see increased expenditure in health, but that's going to have to come with increased expenditure in militarisation. And that's on foot of what the PESCO is mentioning. When we talk about building a new hospital and 200 million for a new hospital, it's actually going to have to be 203 million because the 3 million will have to go to defence spending to cover that as well. And we need to make that clear to everybody in the public so that they know that when we're increasing expenditure on health, when we're increasing expenditure on doing away with our homelessness issues, that we actually are going to be increasing corresponding amounts of expenditure on military. And we have to do that, and we have to get that message across to people right across the country, because I think that's vitally important. And we will see that and you know, I suppose the point today we were talking about was about, and what I was supposed to talk about, which I haven't really done yet or at all, is about how it will impact on our own national expenditure and that is the housing issue and the health issue and that. But there's really very little you have to say in relation to that. You know, one sentence says it. Like, I mean, if we're campaigning and we're pushing for extra money to spend in health services, if the hospital next week I'll be speaking at a public convention about the underspending in the Kenny General Hospital. But I'll make the point, and part of that also means if we get that funding for that hospital in Kenny, that actually means that we'll be increasing expenditure on militarisation in this country as well. And I think that's how we make the connections, and that's how we do it, and we'll do that right across the board, and that's how we'll get across. And funny enough, the Irish people will actually see that, and they'll actually see that and make that connection themselves as well, because I think that's been seen right through the whole campaigns, particularly during the water campaign and the campaign against water charges. Like, I was we in Donegal actually, we were the first to campaign against water charges, and so we led the campaign for a long time, and then the rest of the country picked it up and ran with it, and that's fair enough. And in Donegal we'll be the first to lead the charge, and we'll lead the charge probably against about neutrality as well, and the rest of you are welcome to join in. The key thing about that is that people in Donegal, when we talked about water charges and what was happening with water expenditure, they made the connections all themselves. We didn't have to stand up on the stage and tell them about the connections and tell them about privatisation and what that means for health services and everything else. People all made that connections. You know, so that the Irish people all can make those connections and themselves, and we just need to, all we need to do, and we have to do, what we have to do, is just formulate and put it out in words and let them, and take it from there. And I think that's vitally important, and I think that's what the importance of today leads on, and actually we can go out and we can really have the strength of knowing that the people in this room are behind it and working on against PESCO, and as politicians we know we can go on and we can go out and say that in the public as well, and that's going to be vitally important. Because this is going to be a long struggle, and it's going to be a long battle, but I think it's vitally important that we do have it, and we make sure that we do win it ultimately, which I think we will. I think that our policy of neutrality has been vitally important, and it's important to everybody here, and even the people on the street who maybe are more interested in doing the shopping today on a Saturday. It is there, and all we have to do is awaken it, and that's the important thing, and that's what's vitally important. And I